Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Wayne Tanaka. I'm with the Sierra Club of Hawaiʻi. And on behalf of the Sierra Club, the Surfrider Oahu chapter, and the Relocate Puʻuloa Firing Range Coalition, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's talk story on the latest updates and health concerns regarding the Puʻuloa Range Training Facility in Ewa Beach. With the consequences of Red Hill, still unfolding, it's so important for us that people are able to understand how connected we are to the environment, to the Aina, and how much our environment is a part of our daily lives in all the ways, and also how much of what we do has a direct impact on the things, the people, the places in the environment that we depend upon and that we care about. And so for today, our hope is that more people, especially those who reside, fish, swim, surf, recreate in Ewa Beach, are able to understand what may be in their environment and to assess their own risk tolerance when there are indications like we've been seeing of environmental hazards. For us, this is also especially important when dealing with toxics like lead and other heavy metals that can have generational impacts, generations-long impacts, especially given the vulnerability of children and of infants and the unborn to lead exposure. And before we start, I don't want to forget the cultural significance of Puʻuloa and Ewa. This region is known for cultural sites for iwi kupuna or ancestral burials, for gathering grounds for limu and fish. Puʻuloa itself, what we call Pearl Harbor, was known for its abundant fish ponds and its fisheries and cultivated mauka lands, and there's much more that could be said that unfortunately we don't have time for. But I did want to highlight that significance and maybe help people reflect on the appropriateness of this firing range in the region. Being said, to help with us understand what's going on today, we have 4 panelists with a range of backgrounds and specialties who can hopefully let us know what we know from the data, what we don't know, and what we might want to be concerned about, as well as what we can all do to minimize the potential risks and impacts of environmental contamination. So our first panelist today is Dr. Alexander Giles. He's a marine biologist based on Oahu and is the vice chair of the Ewa Beach Neighborhood Board, number 23. As a resident of Ewa Beach, living really close to the Puʻuloa Range Training Facility, and as a representative for his neighborhood, Alex has been actively involved in efforts to engage with the U.S. Marine Corps, which owns the facility, as well as local and state representatives to understand the potential impacts of this firing range on the community. Our second panelist today is Diego Rivera. Diego is a Quechua descendant and a Native Hawaiian rights and environmental law attorney based here on Oahu. He holds a bachelor's in environmental earth and soil science, as well as a master's in environmental science and management from California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. And he recently graduated from the William S. Richardson School of Law here in Hawaii with a certificate in environmental law. And being of indigenous ancestry, Diego strives to advocate for Kanaka Maoli in ways that uplift indigenous values and Pono natural resource stewardship. Also with us today is Dr. Eileen Nally. Dr. Nally is with the Fisheries Extension faculty at Hawaii Sea Grant at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. In this role, she leads a program focused on understanding the impacts of pollution and land use changes on the health of coastal ecosystems in the Pacific, with a particular emphasis on community collaboration and engagement. And through this work, she hopes to support communities and managers in Hawaii and across the Pacific as they work to restore abundant fisheries and food security. And finally, our fourth panelist is Lauren Hansen, who's a Grail Fellow, also with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant Program. Ms. Hansen's work focuses on the coastal and marine resource management of emerging contaminants. So in this role, she is now conducting a needs assessment to identify gaps and opportunities for managing pollutants. She also aims to support communities and managers in Hawaii and the U.S. affiliated Pacific Islands in building resilience and protecting their coastal ecosystems. Lauren holds a master's in public health and a BS in global environmental science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And so mahalo nui to our panelists for joining us today, for sharing your thoughts and your insights on what folks should know and what they can do about the latest information regarding the Puʻuloa firing range. Before we begin, I did want to note we're hoping to have a robust question and answer session so that these experts can answer any questions, address any concerns that you may have in particular. So if you do have any questions, as the presentations go forward, please enter them into the Q&A, which is should be at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can. Without further ado, I will now pass the mic on to Alex, who will give us a summary overview of the studies, the reports, the resolutions and community concerns that have been raised relating to the Puʻuloa Range Training Facility. Thank you so much, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Wayne. Let me just get it set up here. All right, that show up okay, Wayne?
Yeah, looking good.
Okay, thanks everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. I'm going to give you basically an overview of the threats to the Ewa Beach community. I'm really going to be sharing kind of the facts of what we know at this point, right? So before I do that, just to orient you a little bit and let you know that I'll be referring to it as PRTF, which is a Puʻuloa Range Training Facility. And it's located right in the middle of a big residential area. I've highlighted kind of the nearest homes here in red, and you can see it's very close. And it's the only military shooting range in Hawaii that is located in a dense residential area. And as far as we know, it's the only one in the nation. So very close to homes and has a lot of implications. It's also adjacent to Puʻuloa Beach Park. This is a big aggregation area for community members, practice cultural activities, a lot of fishing, and the Keiki and Kupuna hanging out here a lot, barbecuing and all that kind of thing as well. It's also directly adjacent to Iroquois Point Elementary School, and then to the west is the Ewa Beach complex, which is one high school, one intermediate school, and 3 elementary schools. So implications there as well. And then the berms of the firing range are actually located right literally on the beach, right? So they're on the sand dunes, and this has major implications when we're talking about contaminants and things that we'll get into here during my presentation and subsequent presentations as well. And I'm going to go through these primary threats, right? But here's just an overview. There's lead contamination, and that's the one I'm really going to be focusing on today, but I will mention noise pollution issues, the Ewa Beach Homestead project that's going to put Native Hawaiian families next to this range, and as well as a couple of safety concerns. And what this really leads us to is that there's only one solution, and that's relocate the range and then clean the contaminated berms. I also want to point out that lawmakers already urged relocation of PRTF, and this actually happened prior to the most recent lead findings. So the Marine Corps just finished up testing earlier this year and released a draft report summarizing those findings, which you'll hear about from Diego and some others, some of the other panelists. But the PRTF relocation resolutions were introduced by the Ewa Neighborhood Board, by the Hawaii House of Representatives, and the Senate. And there were various hearings held to evaluate the health and safety impacts and threats to the community. And the representatives and senators concluded that it was really impossible to mitigate these threats. And so the resolutions passed without opposition, 47-0 and 25-0. And what the resolutions did was call on Marine Corps Base Hawaii to relocate the range to a more suitable location. I do want to point out that to date, no effort has been made to identify a potential relocation area at all. And there was this House Resolution H18 to establish a working group that was established by our former Representative Martinez, which has never met. They had an introductory press conference, but they've never actually met to do anything to move forward on understanding and evaluating the impacts of the range to the community. All right, so I'm going to focus here on high levels of lead contamination that are now evident in PRTF in the berms. And so just to orient you to that, on how that occurs. So here you see a bullet. Most bullets these days, and for hundreds of years, are created with a lead core. And so when those bullets impact whatever they're shooting at and they break apart, what they do is they lead lead particles, and that can be seen here with the lines in black. And so you can see a lot of those particles are very fine. So even when you hear about sifting of the sediments and things where they're getting the fragments, they're not getting the lead particles, which remain in there. When you're talking about PRTF, which is a range that's been around for 115 years, you can imagine the amount of accumulation. And so how does that actually happen? Well, you have the actual firing point there, firing point there on the left. And so you have some minor, you have accumulation of lead there from the casings and the primer residue from the firing, but the bulk of the lead accumulation actually happens in the berms. And so once they're in the berms, 115 years of firing to these berms daily, then you're going to have this accumulation, which then can leach horizontally, vertically, and actually through the air as well. Now we actually have, at this point in time, we have 4 separate tests that have all found alarmingly high levels of lead. And I'm going to talk about all 4 of them. What I want to point out on this slide is that no level of lead is considered safe. And here in Hawaii, the Department of Health has lead limits that are 200 milligrams per kilogram for residential property. That's soil levels. But again, no level of lead is safe. So let's talk about the first test. This was conducted in 1999 by the U.S. Marine Corps. This was 25 years ago. Think about that. So these were tests actually on the inside of the berm, right? So there, when we look at the range, you're talking about on the inside of the berm. They're in the bullet pockets in that whole area where bullets are landing. What they found was 37,000 milligrams per kilogram. That's 185 times the Hawaii state residential limit and 46 times industrial limits. So what we've heard the Marines say is that, well, it's a range. That's what we expect. And well, yes, but the problem is that range is in the middle of the community. It's susceptible to erosion, to tsunamis, to airborne contaminants. So that's a major problem. Just having those toxins in the ground so close to community. The second test was in 2022 by the Surfrider Foundation. This is the one that really set off a lot of alarms, and they actually tested now on the outside of the berms. The previous test was on the inside. So now what they really were looking at is there lead out on the outside of the berms, and is that an indication then that lead is then migrating through those berms and out into the beach environment where it can actually interact with the ocean and then spread into the community. And they found lead 70 times the Hawaii state residential limits, and direct evidence that lead is migrating out of the range. And you might hear arguments that, oh, that's still range property. But as we all know, that area is being eroded and interacts with the environment, and that is then releasing into the environment and the community. So we know this really raised a lot of community concerns, right? So we have this first thing is, okay, there could this signs of leaching. It's coming out. It's going through the berms. We also know that these areas are highly eroding. You know, you can see the image there. That's the Foxtrot and E through F, I believe it is, ranges right there. And in the image down at the bottom where you can see the T-groins, if you look just to the west of those T-groins, you actually see an area that's fairly eroded and kind of going in. And that's because when they created those T-groins, it's actually creating increased erosion along the front of the range. And that's only leading to more contamination pathways. And lastly, and one of the big ones for the community and people living downwind of the range is airborne contaminants. So I'm going to show you a video. This is airborne contaminants has like been brushed off in many cases by when we talk to people about this, but this is one of the main concerns for people living near the range. What I want you to do is pay attention to the amount of dust that is kicked up into the air when firing is happening into the range, right? And you think about this on a daily basis. They're shooting into this 115-year-old lead accumulated berm, and those dust particles with lead particulates are going airborne nonstop all day long. So this is a major issue for if we're playing in the park or you're living downwind from this range. This is a major problem. And so to follow along with that, in 2024, our former Representative Martinez commissioned the testing of homes and fish, and this included dust from the window jalousies of 2 homes just downwind. So we have the easterly prevailing trade winds, and you can see the 2 homes there. The blue bubbles are downwind of the range, and then on several fish that were captured directly in front of the range. And what was found was that there was lead detected in all samples above limits. And this really highlights the need for more testing, right? So there's issues with, what you'll hear is that fish move around and things like that. Well, yes, that might be the case. That's why it's important to do testing in a regimented fashion to see if those lead levels increase as you're moving away from the range, and how, we need testing of these homes to really see how prevalent of a problem this is. And the fourth and final test that I'm going to discuss here is the Marine Corps testing, the most recent testing, because they often try to disregard the Surfrider test. They actually went back and did testing in the exact same area. So they're only testing the berm outside of the beach. They haven't done anything along the sides of the range. But the second test in the same area found very similar results to the Surfrider, really validated the Surfrider results. They found lead 26 times higher than the state residential limits, which is really further confirming that lead is migrating outside the range. They also found antimony, which is another heavy metal, that are over state limits, and they found copper in a lot of samples. So more and more. And so what this all really means when you put it all together is that Puʻuloa firing range is a toxic waste site in the middle of a community. And it's just incompatible just for the lead thing alone. And what's been the U.S. Marine Corps' response to the lead contamination so far? Early on, it was in 2023, it was like, oh, the lead limits don't apply to the U.S. Marine Corps, a complete disconnect with how it might impact the community, and that the pollution's no cause for concern. They've also said in the most recent draft of results that they just released and they sent to the Department of Health, they said no further action is warranted, despite basically confirming the previous Surfrider Foundation results. And so they're really ignoring evidence of lead migration, and they're really avoiding any holistic efforts to evaluate lead contamination. They don't want to do air contamination. They don't want to test other sites. And it's really following the Red Hill PR playbook, right? It's deny, 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 downplay until something real serious happens. And I think that's the main concern here. And what's one of their band-aid solutions that they propose? Well, they said, hey, well, we're going to move, the ranges back. 4 of the 6 ranges we're going to move back. But when we actually look at that, it's actually only 10% of the range area that they're talking about. So it's the 4 smaller ranges in the right that I've outlined in red, and then the 2 larger Alpha and Bravo ranges are going to stay in place. So 90% of the contaminated berms are going to remain. The range will still be immediately adjacent to parks and homes, and it really ignores the stated risks of lead migration from storage surge, tsunamis, and airborne dust that the MCBH themselves have recognized. They've also said that, oh, we're switching to lead-free bullets, so now we're fine. Well, I want to clarify that it's actually only some of the bullets that are going to be lead-free. And it also ignores the 100 plus years of lead accumulation and outward migration. And I think it's evident that the Hawaii Department of Health actually agrees to a lot of this, because in the response to the draft Marine Corps report, they disagreed that further testing is not warranted, and they said elevated contaminant levels indicate a potential release to adjacent beach area and state waters as well as groundwater, and that the full nature of the extent of contamination needs to be determined. They questioned the potential for airborne dust contamination, and they recommended that the MCBH test soils along the western perimeter of Range A, so that's the side adjacent to the community and Puʻuloa Beach Park. They said to test additional samplers closer to the ocean and to install groundwater monitoring wells, excuse me. Okay, so that's lead. Lead is a problem. We know that. Just jumping through the other issues pretty quickly is that there's extreme noise pollution. There's a public address system, a PA system and firing that occurs from 7 a.m. until sunset. That's extremely loud, and this can have major health impacts. If you're someone that works at night and you're trying to sleep in the day, if you're a veteran with PTSD, all these things can have major impacts on people living around the range and in these communities. And they've proposed some more band-aid solutions for this as well. They said they've actually lowered the volume of the PA system, but you slowly hear it starting to creep back up. So they're after many, many years of asking, they did something, but then they're kind of ramping it back up. And then they've also spoken about placing a single sound dampening wall on the western side of the range, but that really has an imperceptible impact due to the distance from where the firing actually occurs. So these dampening structures need to be directly adjacent to where the firing occurs, where within the range, it oftentimes can be 1,000 meters away. And so that sound just carries over. And so basically what it is that having a range 200 feet from residences just makes extreme noise unmitigatable. The third issue, and one that I mentioned early on, is the Department of Hawaiian Homeland's plan with the ʻEwa Beach Homestead project. We're super supportive of this project. I think it's great. I live right next to where this is going to happen. I think it's a great project, but the families will be subjected to the range's multitude of threats and issues. And so we support this DHHL project, and we're asking DHHL and the people that are going to be living there to support the range relocation. And lastly, the primary issue I'm going to talk to you about is safety concerns. So there's bullet and fragments escaping the range. The the Marines have stated that it's impossible for anything to escape, any bullets to escape the range. But we know that's not the case with ricochets. And actually, from a local naturalist out there with a metal detector just recently found bullet fragments all over in front of ʻEwa Beach, in front of Puʻuloa Beach Park. And during the Marines' own recent sample collection, they also found extensive bullet casings. And so this is evidence that shots are getting outside the range. And the other safety concern, as part of number 4, is the fact that the Marines have what's known as a surface danger zone. So this is something that they implement themselves as a way to avoid any potential accidents. And so if you've ever swam or boated in front of the training facility, you will hear the loudspeaker telling you to get out of the water. However, the airline flights approaching the international commercial airlines approaching Honolulu International Airport fly right through the heart of this surface danger zone. And so the Marines are basically just exempting themselves from that issue. And so I'm going to show you a video here, and it's a really good video because not only does it show you the first 2 clips are showing you the plane right in front of right in the range, right? So you don't hear a lot of shooting. But this video is good because you're also going to hear in the next couple clips a lot of the sound that I spoke to you about, noise pollution and things like that. So you're going to hear it. So there you see the planes flying directly in front of the range. They're right in that shot. Imagine if a bullet escaped over and hit those. Now you're going to hear it. You can hear the PA system there. You can hear the firing, and you see the plane going right through the heart. So really, there's a win-win solution to this, and that's to relocate the firing range. The synergistic impacts of PRTF make it incompatible with the existing community. It's just the reality. Even if they were here before a lot of the community, that's beside the point. It's no longer compatible. Also, PRTF is extremely outdated. The Marines would really benefit significantly from a modern training facility in a non-residential area. And the Marines I often engage with, it's not, they're doing their job and they're kind of defending this thing. It's really at a higher level that this needs to happen, and we need to relocate the range and provide them with the resources so they can train better, and so they're not impacting the environment and people that live in the area. There's multiple locations across the state where this could occur. And we really need Hawaii's congressional delegation to secure the necessary resources for relocation and make it happen. And, it's what we have to prioritize above all else: the health and safety of ʻEwa residents and our INA and our island home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this comprehensive summary of what's been going on, and for all of the work that that the neighborhood board, that the Relocate Puʻuloa Firing Range Coalition has done to get this information out into the community and before our decision makers, and really ultimately, helping to keep our people safe and as well as our island. So up next, we have Diego Rivera, who again is an environmental and Hawaiian rights attorney with a background in soil science and environmental management. Diego will give us an overview of the Marine's most recent soil and sand testing that Alex mentioned, as well as other research indicating how lead and heavy metals may be moving out of the firing range, and also where further studies should be directed given the many ways that people can be exposed to these kinds of toxic contaminants. So with that, I will hand it over to Diego.
Thank you, Wayne. Is the slideshow up on the screen? Awesome. Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Diego. Thank you for the introduction, Wayne, and I really appreciate Alex's informative discussion of all of the issues associated with the shooting range. I'm going to focus in a little bit more on the 2024 results, as well as specifically the lead contamination pathways, as Wayne mentioned. So just to briefly discuss what was sampled in this most recent round of sampling and testing, it was only the top 4 to 6 inches of soil in these what they call decision units. So it's these 150-foot by 50-foot rectangles all along the shore here. There were 24 of those DUs. They were only laid end to end along the shore as close to the berms as they could get. The blue and gray indicate where they found levels higher than both the EPA and the Hawaii DOH lead levels for soil. In this middle square right here, it was as high as 5,375 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram. And then radiating out, it got a little bit lower down to 1946 parts per million, 937 parts per million, and then the rest were about 350. So pretty high lead levels. That also didn't they also tested for antimony and copper, as Alex mentioned, which are other sets of heavy metals that have their own negative impacts on human health aside from lead. What was not sampled in this most recent round of testing was soils on the interior of the berms. So as Alex mentioned, years ago, they did that testing and they found 37,000 parts per million. And now we're dealing with 5,000 parts per million on the outside of the berm. So clearly a lot of that lead is migrating from the inside to the outside. They also didn't test any of the interior of the shooting range itself. They didn't test the firing line. So as Alex's illustration and discussion mentioned, the bullets themselves, they undergo explosions to fire the bullet and then really rapid mechanical changes as they go through the air. So a lot of that lead and the antimony and the copper also comes out at the firing range or at the firing line, sorry. They didn't test soil deeper than 6 inches. And really that's only that top portion of the soil there. They didn't test nearby houses, the beach park, marine wildlife. I have an asterisk here because that is more than just soil testing, right? They have to collect marine samples and go through an entirely different type of testing. And even as Alex mentioned, you take dust samples off the window jalousies at the nearby houses, and so that's different than soil testing. So they have to expand beyond just soil testing. They didn't touch on aerosolized or airborne contamination, as Alex mentioned, and as that video illustrates perfectly, where you have it's by the ocean, it's a really windy area. You kick up all that lead dust, especially with 37,000 parts per million, it's going to get caught up in the air and it's going to start dumping on the beach park, all the homes nearby, the beach and the ocean itself. And they didn't do any sort of vegetation testing. A couple of the studies I'm going to mention later, they actually take plant samples because that lead, it gets into the soil, right? And plants uptake nutrients, and lead isn't a nutrient, but it gets uptaken along with all of the other nutrients. And so inside the plant, you're going to find elevated lead levels, but also because of the airborne and aerosolized lead, you're going to find it on the outsides as well. I'm going to get into a tiny bit of science to explain why testing deeper is necessary, testing like wider than that thin strip of land, why testing inside the range, why testing the beach park, all of that is necessary. So here it's a pretty simple version of what different sizes of soil particles look like. Coarse sand is this big square here, and then as you get to smaller sizes, you can see how, it fractions up. This is important because sand has a lot less surface area than clay. And so in clay, the lead's going to stick a lot easier because of that higher surface area, whereas in sand, it's going to leach through a lot easier. It's going to be more mobile in the sand, which is why you need to go deeper down into the ground to test, and why we need to test fish, right? Because the lead is traveling through the berm, traveling through the sand on the beach, and it's getting out into the ocean, it's being consumed. Um, the parent material, it's coral calcareous sand, and what that means beyond just the soil is it means that not only is there sand up top that's porous and it's traveling through quickly, the underlying rock has a bunch of holes in it as well. And so the drainage class here is excessively drained. So water is constantly moving through there as well from Mauka to Makai. And so as the lead migrates, the water is also picking it up and taking it out to the ocean. This study here, distribution, chemical speciation, and mobility of lead and antimony, is published in 2010. They found that 93% of the mass of bullets inside a shooting range are in the top 30 centimeters, and that's down to 12 inches. So that tells you even just inside the shooting range, 4 to 6 inches isn't enough, right? You need to go at least a foot deep to capture all of the contamination that's occurring. Continuing with lead contamination via the soils. Um, this quote here, vegetation samples collected at range C showed a clear pattern of lead accumulation for this 2006 study. So as I mentioned, as that lead leaches into the soil, the plants are picking up the water, they're picking up the lead, they're picking up the antimony and the copper as well. And so it's called bioaccumulation, right? It's obviously detrimental. Plants, animals, humans who eat plants will ultimately consume the lead and the heavy metals. This next quote, the total lead concentrations in the berm soils in 7 of the 8 shooting ranges they studied for this 2016 study had 400 milligrams per kilogram, so that's 400 parts per million. So again, highlighting that, they only tested the outside of the berm. I imagine that 37,000 parts per million holds on the inside of the berm as well, and even, the interior of the range where it's, as Alex's illustration noted, it's leaching and all that water is pulling it further down and spreading it out. Um, Lead contamination via the air, I wanted to highlight this because they didn't discuss that at all in the study. And I think even in the previous studies they did of the shooting range, they did not talk about the fact that the lead is in the antimony and the copper getting kicked up into the air and carried over. So um, when the window jalousies were tested for I think it was the independent testing, they had 299 and 206 parts per million, and that's above the soil level, and they're just pulling this dust off of the windows themselves. It's not even in the soil where it gets spread out more, and water and different forces act on it to spread it out. You're just pulling that amount of lead off of the windows from the dust itself. Here in this quote, it says, they basically, tested plants for lead contamination or not. They found that when they washed plants, it was 42% lower amounts of lead, which means that or a lot of the lead that they found with these plants adhered as dust on the outside of the plants themselves. So that, I think, indicates we got to be testing more than just little soil samples in one thin strip. Another study here, lead was mainly concentrated in roots, and the increased lead concentrations observed in the above ground parts can also be attributed to atmospheric deposition of dust particles containing lead. So I just pulled 2 or 3 different studies here that have looked at lead contamination and specifically whether it's from the air or from the soil itself. And just these few alone talk about the existence, the undeniable existence of land contamination via air travel, right? Lastly, I think these are the last couple studies I have here. Lead aerosols undoubtedly represent a considerable risk factor in many industries. Uh, Shooting and accompanying procedures represent a combination of both thermal and mechanical straining, resulting in considerable dermal and inhalation exposure. And so that highlights why we need to test the firing line itself, because not only do we have the bullet fragments at the end of the range on the berms, every time you're firing a weapon, you're causing an explosion and you're pushing out a bullet at multiple 100 meters per second. And that puts these incredible strains on the bullets before they even get to the berm and causes lead and antimony and copper to exist at the firing line itself. And they even noted in the same study that not only are the shooters being exposed to this dust from firing the weapons, but the supervisors behind, like you can see here, are also catching a lot of that dust too. So not only is it a danger to the people firing the weapons, it's a danger to everybody because of all of these contamination pathways, right? And so to bring it back home, this slide echoes exactly the slide of what wasn't tested, because all of these things need to be tested to determine what the true extent of the issue is. So we need to test the interior berms. We need to test the sides of the berms. We need to test the interior part of the shooting range, the firing line. We got to go deeper than just 4 to 6 inches because as it's just a scientific fact, it leaches and moves laterally and horizontally, right? We also need to do more testing of marine life, of the beach park, of the windowsills on houses nearby. We need to take into account the aerosolized and airborne contamination because that's dumping a lot of lead on the community too. And even vegetation, we need to look at not only what kind of heavy metals those plants are uptaking, but also getting covered in that aerosolized and airborne contamination. So when we're asked like what can be done, I think one of the intermediate steps is we need more testing and we need to test all of these things here so that way we can know exactly what and it's a problem and we need to know what the extent of that problem is because even just these few samplings that they did indicate an incredibly contaminated area on the outside, right? So yeah, we need to do way more testing. They kind of cherry picked and um minimized that testing strip as much as possible, so we just need to do a lot more. And so that's where I'm going to stop. Hopefully that wasn't too long.
Thank you so much, Diego. Yeah, that the aerosolization of heavy metals is disturbing I guess to say the least. Um, and I do think they were windowsill samples that showed high levels of lead. Uh, okay, I um did next we have Dr. Eileen Nally and Lauren Hansen from UHC grant, who have researched and are researching lead and other contaminants in coastal environments in Hawaii and across the Pacific. And so they will share with us, how some of these latest lead samples, the data from them compare to established standards and to other places, the health consequences of lead exposure, and what this may mean in terms of as Diego also touched upon the need for more testing. Eileen and Lauren, please take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll just, I'm going to keep it relatively brief. I just wanted to touch on a few sort of main points from the more fish-centric environmental perspective and sort of put these levels of lead in the context of other places we've seen in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. I'm Eileen Nally. I work at the University of Hawaii, and we've done a number of studies elsewhere looking at lead levels in sediment and fish, as well as a big review. So I'll just touch on some of that and then happy to answer questions later. So as has been mentioned, there has been sampling done, some sampling mostly of sediment, and the levels have been very elevated, above these environmental action levels for residential and industrial areas. And so we know that there is a definitive problem, at least in some of these concentrated areas with lead concentrations. But these levels are sort of one metric that we can use. There's a lot of different ways of assessing risk that are complicated and can vary quite widely. So that's one thing I wanted to sort of highlight, is that using a sort of one approach isn't always the only one. So we've looked more in the context of impacts on marine life from lead and sediment concentrations. And so this is just an example of some of the lead concentrations we've measured elsewhere in Hawaii. On the bottom of the graph there, you can see different site locations. On the y-axis or the vertical axis, you can see lead concentrations. This is in micrograms per gram, but it's comparable, or it's the equivalent value to milligrams per kilogram. So this is using NOAA's thresholds for impacts on marine life. And so the points that are in green, no likely impacts. The points that are in purple, negative impacts are possible for marine life if they're exposed to these levels of lead in coastal marine sediment. And in orange, the impacts are likely. And so I just wanted to highlight that when we talk about 200 milligrams per kilogram for residential properties, this is thinking about people directly consuming the sediment with lead in it and sort of these different types of exposure. But when we think about potential impacts on marine life, maybe they're far more sensitive in some cases. And so the values are actually quite a bit lower. But also to highlight in Keʻualo, which is a pretty industrial area that has had a lot of impacts historically, we're seeing values that are quite a lot lower, orders of magnitude lower than what are being measured in Puʻuloa, and these values were enough for us to say there's potential impacts on marine life. So going from that, we can say it's very likely that there are impacts on marine life also in the Puʻuloa ʻEwa area from the values that are being reported. And again, just as a reminder, some of these values are much, much, much higher than 100 milligrams per kilogram or micrograms per gram. And so really orders of magnitude difference when we think about the concentrations. And then again, the area that has been highlighted sort of represents one area, but it's been talked about a lot that there's the potential for contaminant migration into the environment. And once it's out there, it's really difficult to predict and assess how contaminants might move from a shoreline through a coastal marine system, a coral reef system, and especially into the food web as they migrate through different organisms and get taken up in different ways. And so while a lot of the focus has been on this one sort of small area, as has been highlighted, the potential impacts are much broader. And so thinking of this small area where there have been fish tested, the values measured were up to beyond 7 milligrams per kilogram. And so, as Alex mentioned in his first presentation, there were pretty high levels of lead measured in the 4 fish that were sampled. And there's this threshold of 0.3 milligrams per kilogram for consumption. But I want to emphasize that's just the FAO threshold. There's different thresholds for different health organizations. And so another one that is used is the World Health Organization guidelines, which is actually even lower at 0.2. And so this is a plot of lead concentrations in fish that were sampled from different sites throughout Hawaii. And again, I'm showing this to bring your attention to a point that we had before considered to be potentially problematic because it exceeded this World Health Organization guideline at Keʻualo. And emphasizing again that among the many sites that we looked at across Oahu and Kauai, we saw a very clear link between elevated lead concentrations in sediment and elevated lead concentrations in fish. And so the sediment at Keʻualo had the highest lead, the fish at Keʻualo had the highest lead. So again, a strong recommendation that knowing that there is elevated lead in the sediment, we would suggest that it's important to really thoroughly sample the fish. And again, these threshold values are very much lower than the concentrations that were measured in just the handful of fish that have been tested so far. And so I mentioned we also did this big systematic review of contaminant concentrations that were reported across the Pacific Islands. This included, in the final review, 44 different studies at 115 locations, including 226 species and many different contaminants. So I'm showing here the values that we saw for lead specifically. And don't be intimidated by this figure. Basically, on the bottom are the lead concentrations increasing to the right. The shape of the points are the different tissue types that were measured in different studies, and the colors correspond to whether the fish is a piscivore and eats other fish, planktivore eats plankton, detritivore eats sediment, herbivores eat algae and limu, and so on. And so and I have the sort of World Health Organization consumption limit there as a dashed line. And going up on the side are all the different types of fish that were included in the study. So that's just sort of the setup. But why we wanted to do this was so that we could overlay points from places where we were actually measuring concentrations of lead so that we could assess, like, is this a value that is high compared to other places? And what I want to draw your attention to here is that the sort of maximum values that we were seeing reported in these other studies, and this is with our own measured values in the black circles for Hawaii, squares for the Marshall Islands. But the max reported values we were seeing elsewhere were 4.6 micrograms per gram. And this is in comparison to the 3, 4, 7 concentrations that were being reported in just the 4 fish again that were tested in Puʻuloa. So again, this is just a suggestion that these values are definitely elevated compared to what we've seen elsewhere, not just in Hawaii, but throughout the Pacific. And some of these are places that have had a history of militarization and other industrial impacts. And so again, while 4 fish isn't enough to make a health advisory, it's not enough to make a definitive statement about people's health and well-being and the likelihood of getting sick. It is enough to certainly make a strong recommendation that there is additional sampling to understand really what is the range of concentrations that we're seeing, because those that have been measured and reported again are quite high compared to what has been seen elsewhere. And as was mentioned, fish certainly move around, but so does sediment in the coastal zone. And so it's resuspended, it's moved around with wave action. This isn't just in storms, this is on every tide. And so we see a lot of, we'll certainly see zones of concentrations for contaminants, but there's also a lot of potential for mobility. And again, just really want to emphasize that it's important to put this in the context of what we see elsewhere and affirm that these values are certainly high compared to what we've seen elsewhere and warrant additional testing in a way that's really comprehensive enough to make a public health recommendation. And so I'm happy to answer any questions later. I think Lauren has a little bit to say about human health, sort of the direct human health impacts. So I'll pass the mic to her. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. And I'll keep my presentation relatively brief. One moment, let me just pull this up. We'll make sure we can see the correct slides. Excellent. Yeah, like I said, I don't want to reiterate what has already been said too much, but I did want to walk through the direct human health impacts of lead poisoning, specifically at Puʻuloa Rifle Training Facility. And so, as has kind of been talked about already, lead is a naturally occurring metal. However, exposure is known to cause negative health effects at any concentration. And it has been highlighted already as well that lead contamination at the range has the potential to spread via air particles, stormwater runoff, and migration through soil, especially due to the proximity of the impact berms that collect bullet munition constituents to migrate throughout soil nearby. And lead can enter the body through a number of different exposure pathways, through inhalation of contaminated air particles, ingestion. This may include drinking water that's been contaminated or contaminated food source. Eileen is talking about the accumulation in nearby fish populations. So this is something that could be a potential avenue for exposure in the future. And this kind of highlights the need for, just reiterating what has already been said again, that we do need continued testing of both probably drinking water and then also nearshore resources as well to make sure that we're properly protecting public health. And what is lead poisoning? This is kind of an area that is a very hot topic in public health. We've seen other areas of the country have their own lead poisoning and contamination issues. But lead is a toxic heavy metal that has no safe level of exposure. It's also a persistent contaminant that poses both risks to human health and ecosystem health. And it is also known to accumulate in the soil, water, and air, and also in nearby biota as well. So it can accumulate in the bones and tissues of both humans and also invertebrates and other animals. And in terms of human health, it poses particular risk to children and pregnant women. And like I said, I'll keep this presentation relatively brief, so I'll focus all on this slide here. We have a number of different health impacts that have been seen. And like I said, I'll focus more on the exposure in terms of children, because these are the most vulnerable groups, particularly because lead exposure has been linked to developmental issues with children. And so there's also been a concern with exposure in pregnant women as well. Lead has been seen to impair nearly all organ systems in the body, with the most severe and irreversible effects on neurological development. So this is why it's a particular interest in children's health. And childhood lead exposure has been linked to developmental delays, including lower IQ, learning disabilities, hearing loss, and also immunotoxicity, reproductive toxicity, and increased risk of hypertension or high blood pressure, kidney damage, and eventually cancers as well. In adults, we can also see impacts to the reproductive system. There's been decreased sperm counts in males, nervous system damage, digestive system issues, including constipation, nausea, and poor appetite, and then other kind of general, I guess, illness symptoms like fatigue, joint muscle pain, and other effects as well. And I want us to get to the question and answer form, and I know we've been talking at everybody for a while, so I'm happy to just answer questions after this, and I'll kind of stop my presentation there.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Eileen. Yeah, I was just at Puʻuloa Beach Park this weekend actually, and people are definitely fishing for consumption, and they're playing in the sand and on the grass, and I think yeah, as a fisher, this is something that's really concerning to me personally, since oftentimes policymakers and others who don't fish, who don't eat fish, simply write off the ways that people that do consume seafood, including so many working class folks and Pacific Islanders here, can be exposed to environmental contamination. And also, as a parent of a young toddler, I absolutely want to be able to know whether my kids could be at risk of some of these long-term harms. So just really want to thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that concerning information. So we're now going to transition to the question and answer portion of this talk story. But before I open it up to folks, to questions from the audience, I did want to pitch an opening question to the panelists, which is, so what now? What can folks do given this information and these concerns? And maybe Alex, we can start with you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Wayne. I appreciate it. There's definitely, I would say, I think first and foremost, and part of the reason why we're here is to sign the petition and help spread the word to sign the petition, right? And the petition really asks for kind of 7 things. It's like the number one thing is for the Hawaii State legislature and the Department of Defense and our congressional delegation to act rapidly to identify a new location for a range that's away from a population. And while the leaders identify that location, they should enact an immediate moratorium on the shooting or at PRTF until testing and surveys demonstrate that there's no threat. So these combined threats highlighted by the lead findings, they should stop the range until that happens. We need third-party testing for the lead within residential and recreational areas surrounding the range, homes, the park, air monitoring. And we need additional lead testing on the range itself along the Western Alpha Range. We need groundwater monitoring. We need the Marines to do air monitoring just next to the ranges to be able to collect those particulates flying through the air. And then, some public surveys to examine the impacts of and studies to study the impacts of noise pollution. And then enact rules to prohibit the overlap of the firing and the planes flying through those things. And then lastly is most ranges, are outdoor ranges are fully baffled so that the noise isn't a problem. So those are all what we're asking for in this petition. And the strongest thing I think people could do right now is to do that, is to sign it. But also, we are happy to provide additional presentations to certain groups. And I'd say write your lawmakers and your legislators and help put pressure to make this happen. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Alex. Did any of our other panelists want to add any other thoughts on what folks can do? Oh, Liam.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, thanks everybody. I'm Liam Chin with the Relocate Puʻuloa Range Coalition. I do encourage you to, once you sign the petition, we can provide language to all of you. And we encourage you to please send correspondence to Ed Case, Senator Brian Schatz, and Hirono and Takuda, the congressional delegation, urging them to obtain the federal funds to do what we're asking for, which is to relocate the range. So just in terms of the nuts and bolts of this, number one, if you could sign the petition, and then number two, we can, if we have your emails, we can send you language that you can simply cut and paste, and we'll send you the contact emails for your different representatives. But we have to put the pressure on to our elected representatives. These resolutions that pass the State House, the Senate, and the Senate, well over a year and a half ago, have basically nothing has been done so far, and that's deeply concerning to us. So we need to make a bigger push on our elected representatives. So we appreciate you taking that active step in partnership with us.
Thank you, Liam. Yeah, and just so folks know, Liam is one of the leaders of the Relocate Puʻuloa Firing Range Coalition. Has been working on this issue for quite some time. So I'm glad you could join us, Liam. Thank you. And I did want to note that the link to the petition that has been mentioned is in the chat. And also, if you'd like to subscribe for emails and action alerts on this and other issues, there's also a link to our email subscribe page. And thank you, Chris, for pulling those in. We'll also drop in Liam's contact information so folks can also reach out if they would like resources. And also did want to note, to echo what Alex shared. Again, if you're a member of a church or a community group, or surfing club or soccer team or something, and you'd like to learn more, you'd maybe organize a presentation for your group, for your organization, please feel free to reach out. You can email us at hawaii.chapter@sierraclub.org, or contact one of our groups through our social media pages. Yes, okay. So I will go on now to the questions. And again, if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A. Or if you'd like to speak, just type that into and we can let you speak. I know there are some questions in the chat, so I'll try and catch up with those as well. But I guess for the first question for our panelists, so what do we know about the connections between the lead that may be leaching from the Puʻuloa firing range and I guess the lead detected in the drinking water system that are serving some communities in the Puʻuloa area? And I think this is particularly referring to the several thousand lead detections that came up during the long-term monitoring after the Red Hill fuel spill, the latest one at least. And what specifically do we need to investigate to answer this? Do any of the panelists want to reflect on that question? Respond?
Yeah, I'm happy to quickly answer that. Well, I'm not entirely familiar with what groundwater testing is being referred to. What I will say is that when the Marines released their report a couple weeks back, what we found when the Department of Health responded to the lead testing results is one of the first things they asked the Marines to do is test the groundwater wells. I think Dr. Gauss talked about that. He said that the DOH has has pulled no punches. They directly asked the Marines to test the groundwater wells. So that's number one that needs to happen. And so that whether or not it will is another question, because you can talk about the technical dimensions of this, and then you can talk about the political dimensions. This is a federal, the challenge we're facing here is that PRTF is not on state land, like some military installations, which are leasing state land. PRTF, the shooting range, is not. That's actually federal land. That's actually owned by the Department of the Navy. So that creates difficulties where the Department of Health can ask for these things to be done, but they don't have an actual mandate, which again is where the political pressure comes in, where we need to push our representatives to do their jobs and protect us. So I hope that answers groundwater testing straight from the source of the range itself. Let's start there. And then if anybody else has any other ideas of where else we might ask for testing, then we're all ears.
Thank you, Liam. Okay, so next question from John. What is the fix to remove lead from both shore as well as offshore reefs? I'm not sure if maybe Diego or Eileen or Lauren might have some thoughts on this question.
I know less about offshore reefs, but I know that in terms of remediating lead in the soil, there are amendments like I guess fertilizers might not be the right word, but the kind of chemicals that could be found in fertilizers you would use to bind the lead to them and then ultimately remove the contaminated soil. I think the problem that you're trying to mitigate is when the lead is soluble and it's mobile. By adding these different chemicals or fertilizers to the ground, you're basically immobilizing them. And even though you immobilize them, they still can come out of that solution. So you have to remove it from the site. I think if Eileen or Lauren has any discussion on that too.
Yeah, I'll just say that that's a great question because once the contaminant is on the reef, it's extremely difficult to remediate or to get back out of the system once it's sort of released into the environment. That goes for most systems, but especially the marine environment. And coral reefs are so complicated and already under so many other stressors that there's just no, I mean, I'm not aware of any way to really do active remediation once it's in the system, which is why it's so extremely important to prevent it from getting into the marine environment in the first place. And in this case, you have this really concentrated area where there's just these known levels that are really, really high. And so it's a great opportunity to remediate, remove, and deal with that before that ends up on the reef where there's really little left to be done at that point besides sort of wait. Yeah. Also, you can't like dredge a coral reef so that it's not like a harbor or something. So it's really difficult.
Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Eileen. And I guess it really also underscores the importance of not letting things get worse. Which is, I think the petition mentions a moratorium, and it's kind of one of the few things we can do about PFAS as well. Okay, so the next question, sorry, let me find it. I guess, and maybe Lauren can answer this, but is lead poisoning a permanent condition, or is there some kind of way to, I guess, remediate or heal from lead exposure?
That's a really good question. And as regards, there, similarly to most toxicity kind of concerns, it has everything to do with the dose that's being exposed to. So this is especially an issue in children. So that's why children is the kind of main focus of lead, or childhood lead exposure is the main focus in prevention for public health, because if we have developmental delays or developmental issues as a result of lead poisoning, that's going to be most likely permanent. And in adults, maybe at a lower dose exposure, they might be able to excrete some of that lead over time, and then you won't really have as many long-term serious permanent health implications. But if you have very large exposures for kind of ongoing periods of time, then this might have more permanent health effects.
Thank you, Lauren. Wow, okay. Okay, next question. Are there certain, and maybe Lauren or Eileen can answer this, but are there certain fish or lemur or plant species that folks might want to avoid or that might have higher risk of having high lead contamination?
Yeah, so in general, we've seen the highest levels of lead in your lower trophic level fish, so fish that are going to be directly consuming sediment, or like turf algae and algae that have probably accumulated some sediment. And so it's great that the fish that were tested included manini, as well as I think it was a polani. That was one of the four, and an uhu. And so surgeonfish, which include manini and polani, those are often the fish that we see the highest levels in. And so, yeah, it was the super high one. So those Polani tend to eat more benthic sediment, and organic material, detritus, we call it. And like Kole, fish that have that kind of diet tend to be oilier. That's why they're delicious to eat and people love them. But that can cause problems for contaminant accumulation. But regardless, yeah, the it's kind of counterintuitive because we often think of things like mercury biomagnifying in tuna and your fish that eat other fish, and the higher up you go on the food chain, the more at risk you are. But lead seems to sort of be the opposite. But again, it was only 4 fish that were tested. And so in order to make any kind of strong recommendation for what you might want to eat or might want to avoid, I would certainly say additional testing is absolutely warranted and necessary. But in the meantime, just based on what we've seen elsewhere, yeah, fish like manini, polani, anything that's eating sort of low on the food web and sediment would be something to avoid. Or, if you're very concerned, that would be what I would probably avoid.
Excellent. Shucks, I love Puʻuloa and Polani and Kole and okay. All right. Uh, okay. Next question. Has do any of the panelists know if limu has been tested for lead? Limu or seaweed?
No, nothing that. Hey, Wayne, and thanks for the question, Kyle. No, nothing has been tested in the marine environment except for what we shared there. The two manini, the uhu, and the palani. That's it.
Sounds like and with ʻEwa being known for its limu gathering areas, it sounds like maybe that's something that another area of inquiry for folks.
And maybe Wayne, can I just follow up on that really quickly and just say, so when that was just a quick sampling process just to get an idea if there was even any lead in those organisms, right, and in the homes. And so, the whole point of doing that was to have some justification to push to do this additional testing if needed, and all that effort has just been ignored, even though that was financed by a representative, right?
I would just say, Alex, that I think it absolutely served that purpose. The levels seen in those 4 fish, I would say, absolutely justify additional testing. So time and effort well spent.
Thank you. Excellent. Next question. And we have a strong focus on sea life here, but this question is: I keep being told that fishing line lead weights could be the cause of the fish contamination, or the results you've seen. Has there been testing or studies done in other marine environments that could prove or disprove or support or I guess, refute this assertion?
I can jump in quickly. I would say just looking at the comparison to what we've seen measured in Hawaii and elsewhere in the Pacific, where there's absolutely fissioning happening and lead fishing weights being discarded at, one would estimate, probably a comparable amount as in this area. I would say that the elevated levels with the clear sediment link would suggest that there is a link. But again, the only way to determine that is with additional testing. And you can certainly compare the concentrations in fish from right in front of that area to further out. A great thing about a lot of the fish that are most impacted is that you're not talking about, super, super migratory, far range fish. So it's, yeah, I think there's certainly ways to get at that. And
Can I just add quickly to that? Thank you, Eileen. That's correct. What Eileen said is this is not the only place where fishing weights are being used. And the other thing is that we have to keep in mind, this goes back to a question someone posted earlier about whether lead, once it's, shattered into small particles, can it just simply dissolve? The thing about the lead that's being released from these bullets, and they're slowly degrading over time and being broken up, especially as more and more bullets hit the berms and impact. These are extremely small particles of lead that are much more easily transited through the sand and into the water versus a lead weight, which is a solid weight. It's not being crushed up into small pieces quite the same. So it's not like it's being broken down in the same way easier. This is less of an important point, but just visualize a lead weight versus a bullet that's literally into powder, right? That's getting constantly flushed into the environment. The fish are eating the limu, which then get the lead inside the fish, right? Versus a lead weight, which would maybe be slowly ground down through wave activity on a reef, but not nearly in the same way. But I think Eileen's point is primary.
Not to talk too much about this point, but just continuing with Liam's point, some of the studies that I was reading talks about 50 microgram fragments, which are microscopic. You can't see them coming off the bullets. So that's the size of the lead particles that we're dealing with in comparison to, like Liam said, that weight that you can actually see and hold.
Yeah, thank you, Aline and Diego and Liam. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the chat, see what questions have been posted. I guess maybe an Ewa Beach resident can answer this, but at the school, can the firing, with respect to noise pollution, can the firing and other noise from the range be heard at the elementary school?
Sure. I don't. This is Alex again. Thanks for that question. So definitely, so you have to understand the firing range activities move around, and with wind, and so the sound levels can vary quite a bit. But definitely, I think I saw in the chat someone that lives over in Westlock, which is 5 times as far as the school, and they can hear the firing. So you can definitely hear it. Obviously, they're going to be somewhat insulated from the noise within the classrooms and things like that. But you have to remember there is that elementary school that is directly adjacent to the firing range, and I guarantee they can hear that as clear as day, just like all the neighbors can. But my son goes to James Campbell High School, and he tells me that they hear it all the time over there. So I don't think there's any question that it can be heard from those areas.
Yeah, and just to quickly add to that, I spoke to, I won't name the person, but a high-level official at Iroquois Point Elementary School, and I simply identified myself. I was serving on the Ewa neighborhood board at the time and said, "Can you hear the noise of the firing range in the school?" And they said, "Yep." And I said, "Well, if you can hear it in the school, how loud is it when the poor kids are outside at recess?" And they said, "Well, the little kids are the ones out front, interestingly, outside in an area that would be loudest and closest to the range." But I was very disappointed when I asked whether the school officials would be willing to talk about this and engage with congressional officials and so forth. They said that They were not interested. I asked for a call back from the school principal, never received a call back. They seem to be very very concerned about speaking out on this issue, despite the fact that they openly admitted that they can both hear the shooting while the kids are in the building, as well as even much louder when they're outside. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Alex. Okay. This is a quick one. I'm not sure if we have the answer to this, but is anyone aware of the Marines responding to the Department of Health letter that indicated the department's concerns with their studies and the need for more testing? If not, go
Sure.
ahead.
Liam, do you want to take that? Go field.
Meaning, did the Department of Health respond again?
Correct.
Did the Marines respond to that letter?
That we're aware of, no. We've only been able to obtain things that are publicly available. It's possible that they have, but the correspondence between those two entities has been excruciatingly slow. Similar with Red Hill, it's been slow and it's often not been transparent. There's just so many parallels to Red Hill with this that I can't even name them. So as far as we know, no, but that doesn't mean they haven't started a conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. And I think I saw mentioned in the chat there was some email or something, communication from the Marines. I think Kyle might have posted it. But I don't know if that was, it didn't sound like it was in response to the Department of Health. Okay, so we have time for maybe a couple more questions. I guess one question is Rep Oda, the Rep-elect Oda for the district engaged in this issue?
So I'll field this question. So Julie has been quite a voiced interest in getting involved. She's just newly elected, been in her position like a week and a half, right? So we can't expect too much, but she's actively spoken about getting the working group that was established through HR 18 together. That expires in June, so another resolution would need to be made, and that's where we could broaden this a lot. Right now, the way it was created, the resolution was really poorly crafted and is obviously done for political reasons, not to actually answer questions, right? And so that's as evidenced by the fact that they haven't ever met. And so she has. I've been engaged with her directly. She sounds very wanting to learn more, and she couldn't make it today. She sent her apologies. But I did share with her the link for the presentation recording tomorrow so she can watch it, and hopefully she watches the whole thing and gets information. So I'm hopeful that she will help lead this process as we move forward.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, and you did mention reaching out to our elected representatives as being a key strategy to moving this forward. Okay. There's one question about and I think this was mentioned, but it was a question as to whether lead was found in neighboring houses, and I guess if so, how many square miles, or I guess how far away from the firing range was that detection?
Alex, you want to take that one?
Can you repeat the question, Wayne? I'm sorry.
Oh, has there been lead detected in neighboring residences, and if you know the distance from the range?
Sure. Actually, so the residences are located approximately 300 yards downwind. I would say that's an estimation just off the top of my head, maybe a little bit less. So they're 2 streets over from Puʻuloa Beach Park, if you're familiar with the area. So they're very close, and the two houses are 1 street apart, and so that's the only 2 houses. And similar to the fish, the whole idea was to collect these samples to justify if there's lead in them, if there would be additional sampling necessary. I want to clarify too. So in full transparency, I was the one that collected those samples because I was asked by the representative to go out and collect them. And so I have a master's, I have a PhD. I collect things scientifically. I did everything in that fashion. And I don't want positive results. I live right next to the range. I spearfish in front of the range. Well, I did. and I live there, and so I was hoping that these results would be negative, right? I just wanted to clarify that there is no motive, there's no good motivation for me to want lead in these samples, right? And so, yeah, those are the only two houses that have been sampled, and I'm very, very hopeful. I mean, that's one of the main concerns that the neighbors that live around me have, is that, you know, this airborne, and you've heard from Diego and everyone else that spoke today, is that this is one of the major concerns for people that live there. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yeah, so it sounds like yeah, all sample, you know, both samples from the houses and all of the fish samples were hot for elevated levels of lead, which is super scary. Okay, maybe sorry. There is a question that came in about you know, what would happen if there's a major hurricane or tsunami, or even coastal erosion, like how would that impact the neighboring areas? And if maybe Liam or Diego wanted to speak to this question.
I'll just say a quick word, and then Diego, if you want to pile in. I mean, for us, this is the bottom line. Our concern as a community is that let's remember, folks, before a lot of this, we got caught in this back and forth about testing and proving this and proving that. The legislature, through a ton of hearings, decided that this range needs to get moved. The Senate and the House had tons of hearings where we talked it through. The Marines showed up. We argued back and forth. Because on its face, it was clear you have a toxic waste dump sitting a few feet from a densely populated community. And the idea is that when it's right on the shoreline, a Kona storm, a storm surge, a tsunami could lift up that contaminated soil from those berms and dump it right onto the community. And the health impacts would be immense. So this idea that we're calling for more testing. On the one hand, yeah, we want testing in homes. We want more fish testing. We want these things but we don't have to bet the farm on that, because whether or not it's sitting in people's homes a mile away or not doesn't change the fact that a tsunami or a storm surge could easily displace all of that contaminated soil right on top of the community. And as far as we can see, there's nowhere in the country that there's a military shooting range in the middle of a densely populated community, and B, it's right on a shoreline with dynamic weather, sea level rise, and in a place where a tsunami or a storm surge is absolutely possible. So I want us to just walk away with that the testing is important, but regardless of the testing results, the threat will remain that this toxic waste dump is sitting right next to everybody.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Liam said this or not, but we've been talking about it as a ticking time bomb, right? Like it's a toxic waste dump, and then we're just at this point we're just waiting for something bad to happen, right? And that seems to be the playbook by the military. I think even beyond a crazy tsunami or a crazy storm surge, there are tea groins right down the beach, which illustrates how bad the sea level rise is starting to get in this area. You know, all across the islands, it's in the sea level rise zone, right? Where, you know, in the next however many decades, the water will rise up to that point. And so if we don't move it, even beyond a catastrophic storm or storm surge, that constant pounding away of the waves and eroding it is going to pull all that lead into the ocean at some point, right? So like even if we're not talking about some crazy picture perfect storm or tsunami, like it's happening now and it will happen in the next however many years or even months, right? So
That's very true. Thank you, Diego. And thank you, Liam. Yeah, a toxic waste site in the middle of a residential neighborhood. So yeah, I guess that's what it is. So right before we close, I want to, you know, former rep Matt LaPresta did want to talk, so I'm going to let him go and maybe hopefully close this out with a few of his thoughts.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. I don't think I can turn my camera on. So those who don't know me, hi, I'm Matt LaPresti. I was a former rep for Eva Beach. I had tried to work on this issue some, but it was the district outside my district, so I got pushed back in part for not having not technically not being my district. I had served on the executive committee for the Oahu group for Sierra Club a couple times, so I'm 100% on everybody's side here. And a lot of the comments I was putting in there, I'm trying to be helpful because we need to be very precise on the language used on the petition for it to have an impact. And I've been looking at there was the SR 138. There just happened to be a typo. I think it linked to HR 138. Easy fix. But SR 138, which passed from the Senate, and then HCR 28, I'm sorry, HR 18 passed in the House, they're different resolutions. And so, unfortunately, what I've seen at the Capitol, you should never attribute to malice what you can explain by incompetence. There's sometimes strategic incompetence that is used and weaponized because without an actual concurrent resolution, it's meaningless. They're not going to act. And so if we go in and say, hey, you guys did this and said this, they're just going to say, actually, we didn't. These were separate resolutions from each house, not concurrent resolutions. That sounds minor, but it's really important because without an HCR/HSCR with the exact same language, we're not going to get the working group. So the working group one that passed, which is a different language from the Senate one, that was just the House. And unless a resolution passes from both the House and the Senate on a working group, it won't happen. And so they can, it's messed up because they can tout on one hand, hey, we did it, we care, see? But on the other hand, frankly, they know what they did, but they didn't actually pass something meaningful. On the second issue, to get actual funding for this, because I guarantee that they're going to push back and say, well, we need a funding measure. We need to find allies in the legislature this session to introduce a funding measure to do this testing from the state side, because I don't think we can count on the feds to do it. Certainly, Schatz has been an ally on this issue. He helped in the past to try to push back against the wall when I was in office. But it's going to need, at the end, federal funds to both clean up and then relocate the range, because the feds are going to push back that it's needed for military readiness. People wanting to demilitarize that issue aside, they're going to push back with that. So they're going to need federal funds to move it and to clean it. But we need to get state funds to do the testing. And nothing that's happened so far that I can see actually supports that stuff being done. And it's sad because it seems like they're waiving it. And some of the people who are really putting a lot of effort into this think that the legislature said this. But from what I can tell, they're going to push back and say, no, actually, we didn't. So anyways, I want to make myself available. If I can help in any way in advising that wonky procedures, because it's really it's a skill set you only learn by being there. So thank you so much for working on this, because certainly it seems like there's some lead poisoning, and we really need to get a very clear picture as to how much has been done. But you guys got to clean up the language of the petition, and we got to be on the same page with the legislature speaking the language that they spoke. So thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Presley. Yes, the strategic incompetence is unfortunately something I feel like I'm very familiar with. So we are at the top of the hour. And just thank you everyone for sticking with us this for our talk story. Again, there are links in the chat to the petition. We also have our contact information, how to sign up for emails and action alerts, as well as our email address. And if you have any other questions, you can send them to hawaii.chapter@sierraclub.org, and we'll try to see if we can get some of our experts to answer them. Before I close, I just want to say, huge mahalo nui again to our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us. Thank you to the Relocate Puʻuloa Firing Range Coalition for your years of effort. And really, this is, this work is not just for ourselves and our communities now, but for the future, for our children and grandchildren, and these are persistent contaminants that are going to stay in the environment for generations unless we do something about it. So on behalf of my kids and their kids and future generations, just want to thank you so much for all of the work that you've done, and thank you so much to all of you who've attended. As we've seen with Red Hill, as we've seen with so many other places, it's really when people speak up and speak out, that these community concerns that we care about can get addressed, right? And sometimes it takes a lot
Bella
of work.
chimed in only when I was talking. Wasn't even clear that he was at the meeting.
And yeah, so please share this information that we've learned with your friends, your community, your family. When you see folks for the holidays, let them know what's going on, share the petition with them. We can, as we've seen in Red Hill, we can actually make change when we come together and stand up for our islands and our families and for everything that we love. And with that, I'll just thank you again to everyone, and please have a wonderful night and a happy holiday season, and stay tuned for more as this issue we'll continue to work on this issue and this campaign. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.